I've been getting some feedback recently on YouTube saying that I'm misleading people with this series and by not putting vegan directly in the title of each video. Now, in this episode for the polls, we are going to have an ingredient that is undisputably vegan, undisputably historically accurate because it comes from a medieval manuscript. But first, let me ask you this. Food is arguably the most important resource in Age of Empires 2, but all we see in game is just a single set of numbers. Throughout this series, we will be diving in to see exactly what foods each civilization prepared and ate, and how well I can recreate them. This is Meals of Empires. Today we're going to be looking at the polls where they kind of start off in around the 900s, so roughly mid-medieval period, where they kind of conglomerated into a kingdom, or starting with a duchy, and how they relate to their neighbors of the Holy Roman Empire to the south. You have the Lithuanians to the northeast, and you also have the Magyars/Hungarians to the east. Today's food, we're going to be looking at gingerbread, a sausage that you can make during Lent, so vegan, no meat additives, a rye bread that we will also touch on again with the Lithuanians, and to finish it all off, a kasha made out of buckwheat. Let's get started with the cooking. So believe it or not, this is gingerbread. This is gingerbread that I made yesterday. It's a combination of honey, a bunch of spices that you see here, and some rye flour. I'll have the exact recipe on my Discord as always. This is fantastic just to warm you up in the winter, but we're going to put it aside for now. Kasha is porridge in Russian, guessing the same in Polish. Exactly, yeah. So a porridge that you can make with different groats or different cereals. So you could have barley. Today we're going to be using buckwheat, which has this interesting like pyramidal or tetrahedral shape to it. Buckwheat or buckwheat zad, buckwheat seeds as it is here in Dutch. Buckwheat would have arrived to Central Europe actually pretty late in the medieval period. It's actually native to Asia. And there's a few different theories about how it arrived to Central Europe, whether that be via the Mongol invasions in the mid-1200s, or maybe via some other trade routes through the Black Sea, maybe some, once the relations with Hungary, the Hungarian Empire, started to improve, maybe that was one of the cultural influences that came into Poland. We're going to be making the buckwheat porridge very similar to what we did for the Celts, with the Bohemians, with the hubovi kuba. So we're going to add our onions and our garlic first, and we're going to be adding some mushrooms to add a bit of a mushroom broth flavor. And this is very much a staple food that people would have been eating during the medieval period, especially if they didn't have rotating mills yet. If they were just using a hand mill, they might just be turning their grains or their cereals into a porridge instead of into bread. So the most common fat by far in medieval Poland would have been lard, and that would apply even for sauteing ingredients, as we're about to do, as well as to fry ingredients, which is what we'll be doing later with the sausages. For both of those, I'm going to be using olive oil as a vegan replacement. We're going to start off sauteing with our nice olive oil from Portugal, and we'll do the frying later with some lower quality olive oil from Albert Heijn's. Buckwheat is Phagopyrum esculentum, aka common buckwheat. It's in the knotweed or buckwheat family called Polygoniaceae, but buckwheat is very well adapted to cold climates and has a short germination to harvest time, which makes it ideal for growing in those short northern growing seasons. The seed is an achene, very similar to the figs that we're going to be using in a moment. So there's the onion and the garlic to start off our kasha, to give it a little bit of flavor before we add the buckwheat and our mushrooms. While we wait for that to saute, we can take a look at the rye loaf that I made earlier today. And you can see my folds here. There's slightly darker ridge, so not an ideal fold. This is made completely with rye flour, which doesn't rise as much as wheat flour. The reason for that is I believe there's slightly less gluten, and the enzyme, the amylase enzyme that's present in rye, doesn't break down at higher temperatures, so it continues to break down the gluten protein even when it's baking. The way to counteract that a little bit, to preserve as much gluten as possible, is to use a sourdough yeast instead of your traditional instant yeast. The sourdough yeast has a lower pH, grows in more acidic conditions, so it'll inactivate that enzyme to some extent. But that's pretty decent rise from what I'm used to making with my bread. So for our kasha, we're going to be using mushrooms again. The same mushrooms, or one of the same mushroom species that we actually used for the hubovi kuba with the Bohemians. So you can click that link if you want to take a look at that recipe. These were collected in the wild, so I just want to make sure they're nice and clean and we don't have any grit going into our kasha. So we're going to just chop up these mushrooms fairly thinly. We want them to lose most of their water so they start browning up, releasing a lot of those umami flavors into the dish. So we're going to do 250 mils of buckwheat, which is about a cup. And then to match that, we'll do 1 3/4 cup of water, which is about 450 milliliters. While we wait for the mushrooms to cook down and I've set the buckwheat aside, we can get started on our figs. The figs are going to be one of the ingredients in our Lent sausage, and then put into a batter before being fried. In previous episodes, I've mentioned how the concept of frying arrived to Europe, or at least to Hispania, via the Arabs and the Saracens. I'm not sure how this concept of frying would have arrived into Poland. It might have been influenced through the Byzantines. So I pulled off all the stems on these figs, and I talked about how the buckwheat is an achene, and so are the fig fruit. The fruits are actually all of these individual seeds. But in culinary terms, just to make things simple, we call the whole thing a fruit. But in botanical terms, each of these would be a fruit, and they're called achenes. That's what you call a seed that's encapsulated in a hard shell, and it's just one seed per fruit shell. Sunflower seeds are another great example of an achene. Whether figs are vegan or not is kind of a funny concept. The fig wasp will come into the fig. It's trying to get into the Capri fig where it can lay its eggs, but it will occasionally come into one of these standard figs that we eat, the edible fig, and it will pollinate all of the flowers, and all those seeds that you see on the inside were originally flowers, and it will die in there. Now, the wasp body gets broken up by all the acids that are inside the fig, and so you're just left with broken up wasp molecules, compounds, and it's almost like having poop on your vegetables because they were fertilized by manure. You know, at some point, things are no longer an animal product and they're just a product of our environment. And I think you can make an argument that that's what's happening in the fig, is that the wasp is just a product of the environment. It's a very specific part of the environment. Every time you go into the ocean, you're taking in zooplankton, those tiny little plankton organisms. We have to put this all together into a sausage. The recipe describes grating this gingerbread, so I think I'm just going to chop everything up and just mix it and mash it with my hands into something that's similar to a sausage. So that's 75 grams of chopped figs, and you can see we get to 150 grams, so we about have equal amounts of our gingerbread and our fig here. So I'm just going to chop everything up even smaller. The gingerbread is very tricky to chop up because it's so gummy the way I made it. Again, with these recipes, there's no real clear sign of how much you should add of each of the ingredients. The spices were explicitly given ratios in relation to each other, but the honey was just described as a mass, and for the gingerbread, it said rye would be a good idea. So a good idea doesn't really describe quantity. One reason the gingerbread holds up so well is that, like honey, it doesn't have much moisture, so it can remain as a biscuit for quite a long time. In fact, in some varieties of gingerbread, people leave it out to kind of ferment. It's fermented in a cold environment, so it's not allowed to go too crazy with a fermentation boom, but it's said to add some interesting flavors. The great thing about the way I made it is that it's very sticky, so it should hold together as a sausage with these figs that are, you know, fairly sticky themselves. The mushrooms look good, so we're going to add our buckwheat, get all of that lovely browning off the bottom of the pot. That's where all that umami flavor has leaked out of the mushrooms. We're going to cover that. It should take about 30 minutes to cook into the kasha that we want. You can see it's melded together pretty well. And this is described as a Lent sausage because during Lent you're not supposed to be eating animal products, and instead you can have this replacement. And the recipe tells us to put it into a batter similar to what you would have in a German pastry. Before we get to the batter, we can start with the first trivia question for today. Name 2 civilizations that fought over control of the Danube River, an important trade route into Europe from the Black Sea. I don't think Bohemians would get down into the lower portion of the river. The civilizations that I was thinking of were the Byzantines, the Bulgarians, the Magyars/Hungarians, and the Turks. So in the early medieval period, the Byzantines, or the Greeks who were left over after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, were controlling roughly the area around Constantinople. It shifted whether it was further west or further east, but Constantinople was that fixture. And most of the trade coming from Asia, that includes a lot of the spices that we have in our gingerbread, such as our cloves, our ginger, our nutmeg, would all have been coming from Asia. They would come across the Indian Ocean usually. If they're going by a seabound route, they would go across the Indian Ocean, and then they would go up the Red Sea, across Egypt, into the Mediterranean, and then from there, they could go through or past Constantinople, now Istanbul, of course, up into the Black Sea, and then through the Danube River. And I'm realizing now all this is backwards from what you guys are seeing. Maybe I'll mirror this just so this is the proper direction, but maybe I won't. So a very important trade route to be able to make gingerbread. The Byzantines would have been the first civilization controlling that. Then after that, it might be the Bulgarians, who were around modern-day Romania or Bulgaria. Then you also have the Hungarians, or the Magyars, once they arrived from the east, would be taking control of that land. And then, who was the 4th civilization that I mentioned? Right, the Turks. Eventually, the Byzantines fell to the Ottoman Turks in the late medieval period, and the Turks were marching into Central Europe and were being fought by both the Poles and the Magyars. So the typical batter from the 1400s was to use wine, which is a little bit surprising since wine wouldn't be the most common alcohol found in Central Europe, or at least Northern Europe, where beer and mead was a little bit more prominent. Wine requires, somewhat warmer weather for grapes to grow successfully. But that was what's in the recipe, so we're going to continue working with the recipe. I'm going to start with 120 grams of flour. I'm using whole wheat flour here. For our wet ingredients, we're going to add 60 grams of water and 50 grams or mils of our white wine. So I'm going to add enough of this cheap olive oil that we can fry our ingredients. Once the oil starts smoking, we know it's hot enough. Until then, we can wrap up our sausages. I'm just trying to roll them through the batter, get as much as possible coated on the sausages here. There we go. It's not going to have like a super clean outside, and I think that's because this mixture might be a little bit on the dry side. So we're just adding a spoonful of sugar and a spoonful of salt. Sugar would have been fairly difficult to access. It would have had to come through those same trade routes. We do have some leftover batter. I'm just planning to throw that in the oil after our sausages are done and just treat it as, I don't know, a fried pastry or something. While that last bit is cooking, we can do our second trivia question. What now outlawed trade did the Poles engage in during the early Piast dynasty to finance their knights and conquests of surrounding tribes? The Piast dynasty was the first dynasty of the Polish kingdom. The now outlawed trade was the slave trade. During raids and conquests of neighboring tribes during the early medieval period, so we're thinking like 800s to 900s here, the Poles would take hostages and bring them to Prague, the center of the Bohemian civilization during the time period. And since all these Polish tribes and Polish people were not Christian, they were taken in by the Bohemians as acceptable slaves. They were all these pagan Polish people. They were acceptable slaves that weren't just slaves in Bohemia, neighboring Poland. They were sent all the way down to the Caliphate of Cordoba, the Muslim governments in Spain or Hispania and sold there where they worked, I guess, for the government in some way. And the slave trade died out following what is known as the baptism of Poland, following the marriage of Mieszko to the daughter of the Duke of Bohemia. And so he had to convert to Christianity, and the royal court followed. And then soon after, most of the peasantry, but not the people up in the Baltic states, they were very, very resistant. You can see most, if not all, the water has been absorbed. Some of it has evaporated away. To pair with it, I'm going to have some beets. These are beets that have already been cooked up and the skins have been peeled off. Beetroot would have been the primary source of sugar along with honey in the medieval period until there was enough trade coming in for more sugar to arrive. And we can do our last trivia question as well. What large omnivore was eaten in medieval Poland but is now outlawed? Yeah, Ray has the answer. The answer is bears. You say bears don't taste good though, I think. I would imagine that a lot of carnivores don't usually taste good, and it's generally a bad idea to eat carnivores because there's a greater chance of passing diseases. There is evidence of bear consumption in not medieval cookbooks, but later cookbooks from Poland. And one example that's provided in these cookbooks is bear paws that were braised in honey. There's no clear sign that the medieval dish of a bear claw is related to the modern bear claw that, at least in the United States, refers to a pastry, usually filled with almond dough that's kind of broken up into little slits, and those little slits separate to somewhat look like a claw. I've never really seen the comparison there. And now bears are protected in Poland, and I imagine just about everywhere else has pretty much outlawed eating bears. Just me for right now, taste testing. We'll get Abby's rating after the stream ends, and I'll just include it in the YouTube video afterwards. So to recap, we have our buckwheat kasha. We have some beets on there, just as a little garnish. And along inside there, we also have our pied de mouton mushrooms, just a little bit of mushroom broth to give some umami flavors. We have our Lent sausage in between two slices of rye bread with some honey. Our Lent sausage is based off of gingerbread and figs, and surrounding that is a batter made of wheat flour and some wine and water. And then on the other side, we have our gingerbread that is also in our sausage, but to go into more detail, it is rye flour with honey predominantly, with a bunch of different spices. So I don't know where to start. I guess I'll start with the most typical food. This would be the staple amidst the vegan food. This is a funny critique. I forgot to add salt. Even when I'm cooking for myself, I forget to add salt. Yeah, once I added a bit more salt, it tastes quite nice. I think the beets are a nice addition here. Typically, you see beets as a side for most Polish foods. This feels really odd to cut into a sausage, but we're going to give it a try. I'm hoping the figs have kind of changed consistency a little bit inside. There's some really nice crunch there. I like the fruitiness. It almost tastes like we have jam filled in here. The gingerbread's quite similar to the pastelli that we made for the Byzantines. They're both honey-based, but this has rye as its solid ingredient instead of the sesame seeds we had for the Byzantines. But the difference with this is that, yeah, there's so much more spice, but it doesn't come through in the sausage itself. The sausage, the gingerbread that's in the sausage is a bit more muted. And I'll throw up Abby's scores on the screen afterwards, as well as any input she gave. Execution score, I'm a little hesitant to give it a high score because I forgot to add salt. And the presentation here is kind of meh. I could have thought a little bit more about the presentation. So yeah, execution, I would say we're probably at a 7. I feel like Abby generally gives an 8 for this kind of level of execution, I think, but I'm going to give a 7. And then, should you serve this to your girlfriend? I'd be hesitant. You want to build off of an ancient grain bowl would be how it would be phrased in a modern sense. The sausage would work, but not the way I presented it here. And the gingerbread, of course, would be dessert. Maybe if you served it with like a mead. But getting back to should you serve this to your girlfriend, I think this would hit a 6. Because it's tasty, but it needs some work still. Next week, we're going to continue with the history of the Poles and move up to their neighbor, the Lithuanians. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the comments.